Hey everyone, and welcome back to Be Like Christ. We're talking about Acts chapter 14 today in 5 minutes. If you don't have the handout that you're about to see on the screen, you can download one for yourself, print it off, whatever, free on our website at 2BeLikeChrist.com. There's a link down in the description. And thanks to the patrons and the people who support this channel, who make all this content free for people so they can know God better and know the scriptures better. When did the events of Acts chapter 14 take place? Well, this is a continuation of what we started in Acts chapter 13. Paul and Barnabas have gone out on a church planting journey, and this is the second part of that journey. So this probably took place approximately between 46 and 47 AD. The very end of this chapter, the two preachers returned to their hometown of Antioch in Syria. They stayed there for a while, probably until 48 AD. As far as our main characters here, we've got Paul, also known as Saul. He was a church planter and an apostle who traveled all around the Mediterranean region in the first century. We've got Barnabas then. This was Paul's good friend, and I think it's fair to say his mentor. He was a fellow worker with Paul on these missionary journeys, at least his first one, and he was a native of the island of Cyprus. In the third place, we've got a crippled man, and we don't know very much about him except that he was crippled since he was born. Paul's going to meet him in Lystra, and we will talk about him in a second. And then some evil, pesky Jews. These were some Jews that followed Paul and Barnabas around, and they tried to stir up opposition to the gospel message that they were preaching. Like chapter 13, we've got several locations that we need to highlight here because Paul and Barnabas are doing so much traveling. So the first one is Antioch in Pisidia. And remember, there are two different Antiochs that are mentioned in this chapter, Antioch of Pisidia and Antioch of Syria. We won't talk about Antioch of Syria until the very end of this chapter. So this is Antioch in Pisidia. Paul preached to the Jews there, and he received mixed responses. Some people accepted the gospel, some people rejected it. He then traveled to the town of Iconium, and he traveled there because he was run out of the city of Antioch by those pesky Jews. Then we have the town of Lystra. This was to the southwest of Iconium, and Paul was actually stoned there for preaching about Jesus. After leaving Lystra, the two preachers go to the city of Derbe, to the east of Lystra, and this is where they decided that they were going to turn around and retrace their steps and go back to their hometown of Antioch in Syria. And now for our outline of the chapter. The first 7 verses describe Paul and Barnabas' preaching at Iconium. So after they were kicked out of town in Antioch of Pisidia, they go to Iconium and they start preaching there both to Jews and to Gentiles, and they had a lot of success. But the pesky Jews, they come along and they wanted to thwart the gospel's success in that city. And so the text says that they, quote, poisoned the minds of the population against Paul and Barnabas. And after learning of a plot by the Jews and the Gentiles to stone Paul and Barnabas, they decide that they are going to leave town and they're going to go travel to Lystra and start preaching there. So that is what we're talking about in verses 8 through 18, our second section. While they were teaching in the town of Lystra, they met a crippled man. And Paul healed the man with the power of the Holy Spirit, and he stood up and he started walking around. Well, when the citizens of the town saw this, they assumed that Paul and Barnabas must be gods come down in human form. The text says that Barnabas they called Zeus and Paul Hermes. You might be familiar with those names from Greek mythology or from the Disney movie Hercules. The city was in such a stir that the priests from the temple of Zeus brought garlands and oxen, and they were ready to make sacrifices in honor of Paul and Barnabas. When Barnabas and Paul found out about this, they heard about it, they tore their clothes and they tried to get the people to stop. They told them, we're just regular men. We're not gods, but we do have a message that we want to share with you about the true God, the God who made the earth, God who made the heavens and the seas and all that are in them. But even after some further clarification, they still had difficulty in restraining the people from offering sacrifices to them. And then in verses 19 through 21, we've got those pesky Jews following Barnabas and Paul to Lystra. So Barnabas and Paul's enemies from Antioch in Pisidia and Iconium, they followed him and they showed up in the town of Lystra. And they persuaded the people against the two preachers and their message. They actually took Paul and stoned him outside of the city. How Barnabas avoided this, we don't know, but Paul was stoned. After a short time, and probably miraculously, Paul made his recovery, and he went back into the city, and he stayed there overnight before departing to the town of Derbe. So verses 21 through 28, which is going to be our last section, describes the teaching in Derbe, and then the return home, Barnabas and Paul's return home to Antioch in Syria. So Barnabas and Paul taught in Derbe before they doubled back to Lystra and Iconium and Antioch, and their purpose for doing that was to strengthen the believers who had been converted to Christ during their original visit. And with prayer and fasting, they appointed elders in each one of those churches. They passed through Pisidia and Pamphylia, and they taught in Perga, which they had visited before, and then they finally boarded a ship in Attalia, and from Attalia they sailed to Antioch in Syria, where they had begun this whole journey. They gathered with the church, and they told them about all that they had seen, all that they had done, and all the work that God had done through them to spread the gospel in the Gentile world. And the text says that they remained in Antioch for, quote, no little time, or for a while, for a long time. And for our application in this chapter, I think Paul and Barnabas leave us a great lesson in perseverance. Their Jewish enemies were persistent, and they were certainly a nuisance. But Paul and Barnabas didn't allow their enemies to steal the joy that they had found in sins being forgiven and in souls being reconciled to God and being saved. So I think the lesson for us is that we ought not let a little resistance keep us from serving the Lord and finding joy in the work that we believe is important. Focus on the positives rather than on the haters.